What was life like under the Vikings? In the places where the Vikings took over, there were some big changes. Today's place names in northern and eastern England still show the influence of the Vikings' language, Old Norse. For example, Grimsby in Lincolnshire means Grim's farm. It comes from the Old Norse word by, which means farm, and the name of a Viking called Grimr who owned it. There are lots of words used in the north today which come from Old Norse too. Dale, valley, beck, stream, and fell, mountain, all have Viking origins. Some words we all use in English also come from the Vikings, such as window, husband, egg and skull. Viking settlers also changed how people lived in the north. Small towns grew larger and became important places for trade and the manufacture of goods to sell. Archaeological evidence found at York shows that it was a large town, with lots of people living closely together. There were craftspeople making beautiful items and imported goods being traded by people with connections to Europe and beyond. When was England created? After King Alfred died in 899, his son Edward, his daughter-in-law Athelflaed and his grandson Athelstan conquered all of the lands that had been settled by the Vikings, but they did not want to go back to the old system of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Instead, these lands became a new country, controlled by a single family. England, as it would become known, was a kingdom for all of the English and Athelstan was its first king. However, this was not the end of the Viking era in England. From the 990s, fleets of Viking warships started to reappear in English waters, and they repeatedly attacked and invaded, demanding huge amounts of money from local people. In 1013, a Danish king called Svein Forkbeard conquered all of England, but he died shortly afterwards, and another war began. 3 years later, Svein's son Cnut reconquered England, and became king in 1016. He later added Denmark, Norway and southern Sweden to his empire. A Viking king of England. Cnut and his two sons, Harold and Harthacnut, each ruled as king of England in the years between 1016 and 1042. Danish noblemen were given important and powerful positions, Norwegian saints were celebrated in London's churches and Scandinavian artistic styles were used in stone carving and metalwork. Even after the West Saxon King Edward the Confessor came to the throne after Harthacnut died, the culture in England stayed very Scandinavian, and never went back to how things had been before the Vikings arrived. The Vikings started to change too. They embraced the medieval Christian religion, and there were very few new attacks from Scandinavia. The last serious Viking invasion was led by a Norwegian king called Harald Hardrada in 1066, but he was defeated by the English King Harold at the Battle of Stamford Bridge just 2 weeks before the famous Battle of Hastings. So, what is the Vikings' legacy in England? After the Norman conquest in 1066, the Viking influences in England finally started to fade, though this happened much more slowly in the north compared with the south. However, even though the Viking Age had ended, the Vikings were not forgotten. Danes became the villains of medieval stories, and Old Norse words continued to be used. The descendants of the Vikings stayed in England too, continuing to live in communities all over the country, though mostly in places in the north and east that were once part of the Danelaw ruled over by Scandinavian settlers. But the biggest legacy that the Vikings left behind was so huge that it is often not noticed at all. They started the chain of events that led to the creation of England itself.